It's time to begin our services tonight. I don't know if you see things the same way I do, but after a gospel meeting where you've sat there and listened to good preaching, it almost seems like when it's over, you kind of hit a little lull or a little bit of a quiet time. But if you feel that way, there are some things coming up that you want to pay attention to. October 18 and 19, we have the youth forum, so particularly the young people need to be thinking about that. And also think about the fact that every time we assemble together and worship God, one of our basic purposes is to edify one another. So we are not here just to kill time. We are here to strengthen one another and to glorify God. People that we have them on the radar. Last Sunday morning, my Aunt Lona Young went home after services and broke her hip. The same day they did surgery, and the next day she was home, and she seems to be doing good. Karen Brimseth has had surgery, Jerica Lovett, and Tammy Perry fractured her ankle. There's always a lengthy list of people that we're concerned about, so every once in a while get that bulletin out and take a look and see if there are members of the congregation that you haven't even seen in a while. And if you haven't seen them, try to make contact with them and just let them know they have not been forgotten. Tonight, Matthew will give the invitation. Chris Garcia will be leading the invitation song, number 348. And then before we dismiss for class, Dow Willie will lead us in prayer.
Good evening. Please open to 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 14 to 15. Then David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. Last month, around the time of my birthday, my friend Phil sent me this verse, along with a little video of David Bowie dancing. And I thought it was funny. I told him, there's actually a deeper meaning to that verse than just dancing. And I mentioned I tell him at some time. And sometime around last week, around 10, he's messaging me and he says, you never told me what's so special about David dancing. And I think for a moment, okay, you want to go down this rabbit hole? Because normally when we talk about the Bible, we talk about the Bible for hours on end. He likes the details. He said, yeah, I do. Okay. So we went through Exodus real quick, talking about Abraham and the promise. Talked about the Israelites being enslaved and freed. From there we skimmed through Joshua, specifically Joshua 24, verse 15. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I told Phil, this is what we call foreshadowing of things to come. So we went through Judges, talking about each story relatively quickly. And Phil noticed that as we went on and on and on, things weren't getting better, they were getting worse with each judge. And that's kind of the point. That's why it says, and there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. Until finally we got to the last story, which Kyle discussed last Sunday and was rather ugly. And Phil pointed out to me, when we started talking about this years ago, I would have said, no one would really do that kind of stuff in real life. Now I've been paying attention to it, and yeah, this is real. This is the kind of stuff people do. Then we moved on to 1 Samuel, talking about how Israel was so bad that Eli, the high priest's sons, were sinful. We talked about the loss of the ark, and how Israel's solution ultimately was they wanted a king. And funnily enough, Phil, without me telling him, pointed out that that's not how it's supposed to go. God's supposed to be their king, which is a real good feeling when you're teaching about the Bible and picks up on these things. We talked about Saul and how he started out good but proved to be a flawed man. We got to David and how he seemed to be a much better man. And finally we came to 2 Samuel 6, talking about the restoration of the ark. And so when we came to that, point out that, so this is not just about restoring something to Israel, from one place to another. This was talking about putting Israel back on the right track. This was D-Day. This was this was David saying that he was going to correct Israel, going to put God back where he belongs. And finally, I started talking about Micah's response to David's answer, and Phil pointed out it's way past 12 at this point. I'm like, we've been studying for about 4 hours, and he says, and I said, okay, we'll put a pin in this. And we closed up the conversation. Phil points out, it's all one story, isn't it? The whole thing. I'm like, yes, it is all one story. It's all God's story about restoring his creation. As it points out in John, it's all about John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whomever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. That's the whole story of the Bible. Maybe you need to obey God and be baptized. Maybe you need something else. But if anything way we can help you, please let us know while we stand and sing.
Please pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Dear Lord, we thank you for this beautiful week we're having. Lord, we ask that you be with all the teachers. May you bless them. Lord, we want to thank you for the people that could be here tonight. And Lord, we ask that you be with those who couldn't. In your Son's name, amen.
There we go. You probably noticed that we are just about finished with the book of Leviticus. When we began this particular study, we noted that we have a tendency just to blow over it and just kind of ignore it and not pay much attention to the details. Now, you don't have to know, I really don't even want to say it because I really would like everybody to know the book. You need to look at it closely enough and understand it well enough to kind of get a feel for what it was like to be an Israelite. That's what we're kind of hoping for. That you could kind of look at what's in Leviticus and kind of get a feel for what it was like to live as an Israelite. At least live like an Israelite if they're following what God actually said. Now this is the outline, 1 through 7, 8 through 10, 11 through 20, and we're currently on chapters 21 through 27. Now last week we had quite a bit to say about the priest. We were looking at instructions regarding the priesthood. Several things we noted that the priest could not do. He can't function if he's not clean. He can't function and eat the holy things if he's got some ongoing condition. If he touches something that makes him unclean, he's got to wash and wait till sundown. There are those in his household that are his dependents that he can support. And finally, we got into the idea of defective sacrifices and, for that matter, defective priest. Then we looked at chapter 23, noted that it catalogs the feast days of the Israelites. And then in chapter 24, verses 1 through 10, we were talking about the showbread that was put out basically once a week. And that leads us to an incident. And this incident's kind of funny because when I was a little boy in Bible class, this was the only thing about the book of Leviticus that I remembered. Shelemith's son who blasphemed. That was it. The laws, right over my head, and the teacher just went right by it. So the only story from Leviticus was Shelemith's son. And I kind of think that there might be others that are like me on that. This is about the only story that really took. Now, in chapter 24, let's look at verses 10 through 16. Matthew, would you read that, please? Leviticus 24, verses 10 through 16. Ten through 16. $16 also. Okay, basically what happens here? What causes the problem? Somebody tell me. I'll ask for a volunteer. And then I'll say Jay. Basically what happens here? What starts the problem? Yeah. He's from the tribe of Dan, and I don't know why, but does it ever seem about half the time the trouble comes from Dan, that particular tribe? It just seems that way. This fella, his mother is an Israelite, his father is Egyptian, which might have affected his upbringing and his overall attitudes. We don't know that for sure. but he was definitely going to learn a hard lesson. They struggle, they get into a fight, and he blasphemes and curses God. So in verse 12, they put him in custody so that the command of the Lord might be made clear to them. Well, what do you mean? Made clear to them. In Exodus 22 and verse 28, God said, you don't do that. So what has to be made clear? Penalty. Starting to notice something. It's getting pretty common to notice that God lays out a law in one chapter, then comes back about 2 chapters later and comes to the penalty phase. If somebody wants to volunteer to read through Exodus and Leviticus and note that phenomenon, feel free. But it's something that we are seeing. The idea God starts out, don't do this, he'll come back later. Okay, now we're going to talk about penalty, usually after somebody has violated it. Now, another example, and we mentioned this before, critics will look at the Old Testament and say, if there's a real God in heaven speaking in a book like this, he should have just given a manual, one event right after another, and with no repetition. Well, once again, what we are seeing is that God is dealing with people in real time. And events are unfolding in such a manner as they happen with people. So we get the law, somebody breaks it, we come back, now we're going to talk about the penalty. And we get some clarity on the death penalty, and we get some clarity on the concept of justice. If you drop down to verse 20. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Most of us have heard this discussed, and most of us have heard that eye for eye, tooth for tooth is not talking about personal vengeance, it's talking about judgments in court. And if you look at our context, that's just exactly what we are looking at. We're talking about congregational action. In verse 16, moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. You got a situation where somebody's been brought forward, the witnesses have been there, the witnesses lay hands on his head, he's guilty, they take him out and stone him. Now, in verse 17, if a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. Is there a difference between a man and an animal? From a Bible point of view, major difference. If I kill a man, what happens to me? I'm put to death. If I shoot a deer, what happens to me? I eat it. But if it's not my deer, say it's Farmer Joe's cow, I'm out in the field and I haven't targeted in a rifle, and just for fun, and yes, hunters do stupid things like this sometimes, I'm going to shoot that cow. All right, I shoot the cow. Are they going to execute me? It's just a cow. It's not a man. So I'm going to make it good. There's a major difference between a man and an animal. Now when you look at verse 19, if a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Is that justice? Yes or no? I take a baseball bat and I get mad like this guy did. I walk over to Ryan and I break his arm with it. Is it justice if they break my arm? Yeah. And if this seems harsh to you, keep in mind, think about what kings and rulers used to do to people. as punishments. Nice little things like boil them in oil, burn them alive, skin them alive, flay them. Now, if you think of it in light of the times that they lived in, this was justice. This is what you're going to do. You're not going to do some of these strange things. And verse 22, there shall be one standard for you. It shall be for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God. Now, as we were concluding last week, I made a comment about some of the things that we are saying that had I been living back then, boy, it would have made me proud to be an Israelite or happy to be an Israelite. Would it make you happy and proud to think in my nation there's going to be justice? In the statutes, there's going to be justice. Things aren't going to be totally arbitrary and mean like they are in some other places. Now, we're going to make a little list of things that I would be very proud about, and we'll just start right there. Where we come from, in our land, the code of law says justice. Now I want to go on. And this next one, it's leading to something even greater. Let's look at verses 20. Pardon me? Yes. You read that, he's worthy to die. From David's point of view, this guy ought to be killed, but he's going to restore this thing fourfold, because that's what the law says. And I think most of us, when we hear some of the things like he's talking about there, first reaction, somebody mean enough to do what that guy did, we ought to just kill that guy. But we get a hold of ourselves, okay, what's the law? He's going to restore it fourfold on that. That is because in Israel, you were interested in justice and not just flying off the handle. Now, that is a good thing. Now, if we look at chapter 25, verses 1 through 7, another thing that if I live in Israel, I'm thinking, wow, we got it way better than other people do. Okay, let me pick on somebody. Scott Willie, would you read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 25? Okay. Sabbatical year. Did I spell that right? Close enough. The sabbatical year. When you come into the land, again, this is looking forward to the time that they're going to be entering the land of Canaan. Now, just a throw-out question. When you think about how the sabbatical year is going to be observed, and basically what happens during the sabbatical year, the seventh year, every seventh year, what are they not going to do? They're not going to sow, they're not going to harvest, they're going to let the land rest, and whatever grows of itself, you can eat that, and the animals can eat it, but you're not going to go through the agricultural activities. I wonder if there's any physical benefit to the land. Probably is. I don't know enough about farming to know that. I'm assuming there's a physical benefit to the land, but I seriously doubt that that's the main point. But this I would say, or ask, can you imagine any other nation with a law like that? What other nation does the king come up and say, you know what, every 7th year, we're going to let the land rest. Everybody take a break. Pardon me? Probably should, but who really does? Nobody. I mean, this is something, nobody's got this. And every once in a while, a break is good, and you notice they had quite a few of them. Now, you have the sabbatical year, but the thing that really gets your attention is verses 8 through 17. You have the Jubilee. How many L's in Jubilee? The year of Jubilee. Yes. Yeah. 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 I remember, too, as a kid in school, when we talk about Civil War, North and South, and what was going on in the southern states, growing cotton, they just grew and grew and grew and grew. And did they ever rest the land or rotate the crops? Why did they have to keep expanding west? Because they were killing the land. And that's the kind of thing that happens, I guess, when you overdo it on one piece of land. Well, they're not going to be doing that. Every 7th year they're taking a break. Now the Jubilee, verses 8 through 17. To me, this is incredible. Verse 8. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the Sabbaths, the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, you shall sound a horn through your land. Keep in mind, that's the Day of Atonement. This kicks off. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have a 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow, nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend, or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Corresponding to the number of years after the jubilee, you shall buy from your friend. He is to sell to you according to the number of years of crops. In proportion to the extent of the years you shall increase its price, and in proportion to the fewness of the years you shall diminish its price. For it is the number of crops he is selling to you. So you shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. Okay, how does the Jubilee work? You start counting 49 years. And the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. You sound the trumpet on the Day of Atonement, and like I say, the thing kicks off. Now, the thing that we're interested in is what this is really all about. When you think of the year of Jubilee, if you look at the 10th verse, You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his own family. Here's what we got in the 50th year. You return to your own property. If I sold my property to somebody 30 years ago, I come down the road 30 years later, the Jubilee comes up, what happens? I go back. It's mine. What if I sold myself into slavery 30 years ago? It's a release. I get to return to my own property. I get to return to my own family. That's what this is. I'm going home. I'm going to what was given to me as an inheritance. I'm going to be with my family. I'm going to reclaim my inheritance. And we pointed this out last week. Even in this world, was an Israelite ever without hope for the future? There's always hope. No matter how low I sink in this world, Jubilee's coming. If I'm enslaved, Jubilee's coming. If I've sold everything and don't have anything, Jubilee's coming. So if I'm an Israelite, hope is out there. I'm going to be back with my family and reclaim my inheritance. Now that's maybe down the road, but that's always going to be there. Okay, why put this here? What do you get from something like this? If you're an Israelite, you always have hope for the future. It's out there. And again, what other nation had anything like that? We're going to release all the slaves, and you're going to go back and reclaim your own property. And they're just going to give it to you. I mean, nobody had anything like that. God just took that promised land and the law system that they had and made certain that every Israelite, no matter how low they sank in the world, they had hope for the future. Now, simple parallel. Personally believe the reason this was put here was not just for them, but it's also for us. We're supposed to get something from this. Okay, Christian. No matter how low you sink. How low can you sink? Servitude. We're Americans. We can't sink into servitude. No, but you keep paying your taxes. Can you sink into poverty? Yeah, you can sink into poverty. Can you get sick? Can you live a life that is so stressful by what things are happening to you that sometimes you're tempted to despair? Our bones are cut off. Our hope is dried up. Sometimes you feel like that, okay? Somewhere along the line, every Christian gets there. You're just as low as they can possibly sink in this world. What has God done for us that's parallel to that? There's always what? If you're a child of God, there's always hope out in the future. A couple of passages I want to look at. Keep your finger here and go to 2 Corinthians 4. And what I'm getting at is we're supposed to go back to that passage and see ourselves in this. In 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 17, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Simple point. There's something out there for the Christian, something out in front of us. Let's go to Romans 8. And while you're turning there, if you're an Israelite and it's still 40 years to the Jubilee, I remember as a young kid contemplating the future. Say I'm 20 years old and I'm thinking, 40 years, I'll be 60. That's never going to get here. Does it get here? Yeah, it gets here. Romans 8 and verse 24. For in hope we have been saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we with perseverance we eagerly wait for it. We're saved by what? Hope. Do you have to have something out in front of you to hope for if you're going to be successful? I mean, God put it right out there in front of the Israelites. There's always something out there. And as far as Christians are concerned, yeah, we're saved by hope. If you don't have a fixation on it, you're going to have problems. In Hebrews chapter 6. Verse 19, this hope we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters into the veil. Used a little bit differently there, but this concept of hope is critical, was always critical in the life of the child of God. I mean, even in ancient Israel, God made certain that there's something there out there that no matter how bad it gets, it's coming. Now, if you're an Israelite, like I say, if it's 40 years to the year of Jubilee, would it be easy to say, oh, that's too far in the future, I'm not even going to think about it? Could that happen? What can happen to the Christian? We have a hope out in front of us. Too far out there. I'll not think about it. If you don't think about it, you probably won't succeed. And when we think about the hope, Israel, you're going to go back to your property. You're going to get your inheritance, and you're going to go back to your family. If we talked about the hope of the Christian, could you put it in those terms? In the New Testament, God has given us what? Is the word inheritance used for Christians like it was used for the Israelites? We have inheritance. I don't know how to express this one that well. Probably 2/3 of the people in the congregation like the song, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Is that true or not true? We go to our inheritance and we go to our family. Yeah. Parallel. What Christians were going to be looking forward to in the future, God in kind of mini form stuck that in front of the eyes of the Israelites so that they would always have hope. Yes. Very important, which kind of brings us to the downside of this. Is there any record that Israel ever really did observe the day of Jubilee? I said, is there a record? I like maybes too, but what we're saying right now is, can you ever go to the Old Testament and read that on such and such a time the Israelites observed the Jubilee? Answer is no. Can't read about it. Hopefully they did and just didn't note it because it was an every 50-year occurrence. But if they didn't, how would you give up on something like that? I mean, if they didn't do it, they had this great thing right in front of them, they gave up on it and didn't do it. How would you relate that to the Christian? Sometimes people get the great thing right in front of them and give up on it and don't do it. Any comments? Yes. I would think so too. And do you think anybody ever chiseled on that? Cheated? I mean, we're going through a set of laws where you be honest with each other. Well, looking into this, I was looking at Jeremiah 34, where at the time of the Babylonian destruction, there was the freeing and then re-enslaving of the slaves. You know, we're going to let all our slaves go, and maybe God will be merciful to us, and the Babylonians won't kill all of us. So they let them go, and the Babylonians back off. Oh, let's take our slaves back. Do people do things like that? Yeah, we give up on it because somebody has to give up a piece of property they don't want to give up. Yes. That's Jeremiah, and it's also 2 Chronicles 36. The land shall... There was a lot they didn't do, but the parallel I would make is if you can't read about them doing something this wonderful, they must have given up on it. And we could, how do you understand something like that? Well, actual practice, we have seen Christians do the same thing. Now let's look at verse 23. We're getting into some laws here concerning redeeming. The land in Israel, land was not sold on a permanent basis. You did not sell your land. You essentially pawned it. And you're going to reclaim it later when you could pay the price or you get it back in the Jubilee. Verses 23, everybody look at 23 through 28. A guy's poor. He sells his land. That was the inheritance of his fathers, but he sold his land. Can he get it back? He can redeem it. He can go back and pay it off. Well, what if he can't afford it? His relative can redeem it. But if they never can pay the fair price to get it back, it comes back in the Jubilee. So essentially, you can redeem land, get your land back. How about houses? You ever thought about that? How would a house be affected by the year of Jubilee? Let's look at verses 29 and 30. Likewise, if a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, then his redemption right remains valid until a full year from its sale. His right of redemption lasts a full year. I have a house in a walled city. I sell it. I have to redeem it within a year. Walled city. Walled city, I got 1 year to redeem it. We are treating a house differently from land. Now look at verse 30. But if it is not bought back for him within the space of a full year, then the house that is in the walled city passes permanently to its purchaser throughout his generations. It does not revert in the Jubilee. So houses are different. Now verse 31, the houses of villages, however, which have no surrounding wall, shall be considered as open fields. They have redemption rights and revert in the Jubilee. I don't live in Jerusalem. I don't live in a walled city. I live in a little podunk village that doesn't have walls. My house is treated like an open field. In other words, if I sell it, I can redeem it, and I'm going to get it back in the Jubilee. What if I'm a Levite? The Levitical cities. What if I'm a Levite? Levites always had right of redemption. They always did. So you had the walled city, the country city, and the Levitical city. And they were different. Okay, verses 35 through 46, the redemption of poor countrymen. Now just glance at those verses. You got a poor countryman. First thing you don't do to him is what? If you look at verse 36. You don't charge you don't charge him big interest. You don't do that to him. You don't. It's just not done to a fellow Israelite. All right, in verse 39, if he sells himself to you, you don't treat him like what? You shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be like a hired man, and he goes out in the year of Jubilee. Now, if you notice verses 42 through 46, it does say something about slavery. But if you're going to have a slave, where do you get him? You enslave one of your brethren? No, you get them from one of the pagan nations. From them, you can buy slaves and you can keep them. You can even will them to your kids, but you're not going to do that to an Israelite. Verses 47 through 55. An Israelite does a desperate thing, and there's a stranger living in Israel who's not an Israelite. And this guy's so poor that he sells himself to somebody who's not an Israelite. Are there laws concerning that? Verse 48, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him. Bottom line of this, in verse 50, he then with his purchaser shall calculate from the year when he sold himself to him up to the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall correspond to the number of years. It is like the days of a hired man, he shall be with him. A non-Israelite could not oppress an Israelite. Bottom line. That was just not going to be done. That says that in verse 55. For the sons of Israel are my servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay. This whole chapter, like I say, to me it's kind of amazing. If I'm an Israelite, if I did not appreciate what it meant to be an Israelite, I think I would just look at this and consider some of these things and say, look at what God is laying out for his people as opposed to what the other nations have. This is better. But of course, to me, the big lesson is right there. This idea of holding this out in the future. Any other comments? Chapter 26. In chapter 26, we have blessings and cursings. Now, here is a test. This is a test. When I say the blessings and the cursings, what passage first pops into our head? Or what is the passage that most likely pops into our head? Deuteronomy chapters 28 through 30. That's the one we remember. That's Moses rehearsing the law before they enter the land of Canaan, and he gives a long, detailed explanation of the blessings and the cursings. This is way before that, shorter version. It's shorter, but it makes it clear. Now, in verses 1 through 13, God says, here's what's going to happen if you obey. 26 and verse 1, you shall not make yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you. If you do this, then I shall do this. All right, that word if, how big a word is that? That's a huge word. Only has 2 letters, but it's big. Every once in a while, like in Sunday morning class, the idea of Calvinism will get thrown out there, and Calvinistic doctrine is everything is predetermined, you really don't have any choice. It's hard to see the word if and not come to the conclusion that man has responsibility. If you were an Israelite and God said that to you, would you assume that God was placing responsibility upon me to act in a certain way? He says, okay, if you obey, here's what I'll do. Look at verses 4 and 5. Then I shall give you rains in their seasons, so that the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in your land. All right, if you obey me, then what's going to happen? Everything's going to produce. Going to be good. You're going to have all kinds of harvests. Look at verses 6 through 8. If you obey me, what'll happen? Peace and safety. You'll have produce, you'll have peace and safety. As far as blessings in this world, talking about this world, what else do you need? If you look at verse 6, I'll grant peace in the land so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from the land. That comes up several times in the Old Testament. I'll get rid of the harmful beast, and that sounds like filler. How in the world could you have such a problem with beast to warrant mentioning it? Real quick, medieval Europe. You had some big towns in medieval Europe, but connected by superhighways, correct? They weren't superhighways. Medieval Europe, you had a big city, forest everywhere throughout Europe, little paths walking around. And what was one of the biggest problems they faced in medieval Europe for travel? Wolves. Major problem: wolves. Pick up here next week.